college football nerds. Y'all knew we were going to do the Iron Bowl, and that's what we're talking about right now. Got Josh with me. Of course, you know we're also going to get nerdy on this one. We're also going to talk X's and O's. We're going to talk depth charts and matchups and all that great stuff. We do this every year for the Iron Bowl, and we're really excited. So, Alabama fans, we haven't been too much on y'all this year. Auburn fans, the same. So, I want to remind you, there's two rules. One, if you like what we're doing, give us a like, subscribe, notification bell. Obviously helps us out a lot. But also, maybe more importantly, give us down below your score prediction, and we'll talk about it with you. We'll tell you how wrong you are, and you can tell us how wrong we are. All right, Josh. I think that for Alabama fans, it's been kind of a stop-start the last few weeks with the bye week and then the off week where they didn't get to really flex their muscles against LSU. You and I think that maybe they skirted that game, but that's a different topic for a different day. Auburn, on the other hand, has had some momentum, even with their one postponed game. The last two times we've seen Auburn, we've seen 48-11 over Ole Miss or over LSU, and then this 30-17 win over Tennessee this Saturday. So one of the things that we've noticed in the past, however many years Gus has been at Auburn, is that they seem to, in most years, even when they have the early silly losses and everybody wants to fire him, they seem to get ready, get lathered up, and be rounding out into form for Alabama. Is that what you're seeing with Auburn lately, or do you think it's more because of who they've played and they're in for maybe a shock when they play Alabama come Saturday?
Well, you're really making me lead off with a haymaker here, aren't you? I think it's always a combination of both. Every time you ask me one of those questions, it's generally my answer. Auburn is playing better football to this point in the season. They were not very good, frankly, in any way early in the year. They were sputtery. They won the Kentucky game, but they just generally were kind of out of sorts. The Georgia game was the low point for Auburn for obvious reasons, but I think the thing that really defined that game is that Auburn ran for 1.77 yards per carry. And I think the thing that's really made them a better team to end the season has been the emergence of Tank Bigsby, the emergence of the run game, the offensive line gelling well enough to enable that to work. In the last 3 weeks, they've averaged over 40 carries a game and for right about 5 yards per carry, dating back to really the South Carolina game. And I think that's where they've been getting their points. So every year with Auburn, they run their zone read scheme. They do a lot of sort of difficult core plays that are difficult in the sense they have to be blocked very well. And it always takes them about 5 weeks or 6 weeks for them to really get to where they're blocking those efficiently. They run the same plays over and over again, and they get really good at them. And they're always bad early in the year because it's a simple offense, and they're always good later in the year. But I will say on the flip side, you've got to consider those last three opponents, right? I mean, Ole Miss is a horrendous defense. They are truly terrible. LSU, as we've covered and we'll probably cover again this week, LSU is historically bad defensively for LSU. And then Tennessee is a football team that in some instances has just quit. And even there you have to acknowledge that the offense did not score 30 points in that game, right? They got some gifts from the defensive side of the ball and didn't really move the ball that well. So there is a little bit of a combination of the two. It's enough to exploit the opportunities given, but it's also the benefit of playing some very movable objects.
One of the things that we've noticed and pointed out with Alabama lately is they're not giving up points. And I think there's a little bit of a fallacy here if Alabama fans look at, and don't worry, y'all, we're going to talk about how great you are in a minute. Get ready. Alabama fans are going to look at 63-3 or whatever they beat Kentucky by Saturday, and they're going to look at Auburn struggling with Kentucky, Auburn losing to Georgia, and kind of do a little bit of transitive property here. I think some of that is fair, and I think some of that is not fair, where, Kentucky early in the season, one, Kentucky was better, two, everybody was out of sorts back then, but also, Alabama hasn't played a good offensive team lately. So there might be a little bit of false sense of security in that defense. So talk a little bit about where Alabama fans might need to be concerned coming into this game where they may see 21-point line and transitive property and think blowout city, especially with how the defense has played lately. Let's talk a little bit about where maybe Alabama fans might get a little uncomfortable, at least early in this game.
I think the thing that could make Alabama fans the most nervous in this game is really the defensive line. Watching them in the Kentucky game, when I was flipping through, it was a blowout because of the pressure Alabama mounted, and it was a blowout because of their ability to make red zone stops. But Alabama didn't really defend the run that great in that game. And I would say throughout the year, Alabama's defensive line has struggled a little bit in just generating negative plays, getting the other team off the field. And I think Alabama, for lack of a better word, just doesn't have that ability to stop the other team cold. Now, you look at the final stat line, it was 1.8 yards per carry. They kind of got it sorted, but they got it sorted later when Kentucky was in throw first mode. Kentucky was just kind of out of sorts, gave up, and they had a lot of carries late in the game with backups where they weren't being very effective. Early in that game, from what I saw, it looked like they were running the ball pretty well. Rose is a good back for Kentucky. And I think Auburn, like I said, they're running it well. I mean, and Tank Bigsby in particular has made them a more effective team. I will say this statement goes away a little bit if Bigsby's not healthy. I do think DJ Williams and Shivers are solid backs. They're not the complete back Bigsby are. They're not as physical as Bigsby. They don't bring the combination of speed and power. Shivers can get the edge on guys, and he's an extremely tough runner, but he is flat out small. And when he gets caught in a hole or an inside run, he does get just stopped. I think overall Auburn will get push. They'll get yardage. They'll be able to get 2nd and 6s, 2nd and 7s, 3rd and 4s on a continual basis, which means they'll be able to sustain drives and hit some plays. And I think that's maybe where, the false sense of confidence comes in, playing teams in Mississippi State and Kentucky and Tennessee that are so one-dimensional that Alabama's been able to succeed in the run. Coming off back-to-back games where they gave up 4.5 yards per carry or more against Georgia and Ole Miss.
I think the flip side of this, though, is look, Alabama's going to get their points, and we know that the offense is good, and I think you've got some numbers even beyond the model that might indicate how much better offensively they are than Auburn. And Auburn fans, at this point, you are who you are. If you can run the ball, you can get some points. We saw this against LSU, but I think it's totally fair for us to say on this channel that you don't have an elite passing attack. And Alabama, one thing they can do is defend the pass pretty well this year. What concerns me if I'm an Auburn fan is Alabama's going to get their points. And we've talked about this all season long. Even if you have a good defense, good defenses are going to give up points to elite offenses. Ohio State is a good, not great defense. They give it 35 to a decent Indiana team. Alabama is going to score 40-plus on everybody. And they did it last year at Auburn with Mac Jones coming in, raw. So they're going to do it this year too. And if Auburn fans thinks that's crazy, Georgia, when healthy, gave up 41 to Alabama. So I don't think that's too far off base. The concern I have in this game for Auburn is, okay, let's say they get theirs in the running game. If this game turns into any kind of Auburn having to play from behind and any kind of Auburn having to throw to win, I think they're in deep trouble. Compare that kind of scenario to what we saw last year and how it might be a little bit different this year than last year when these two teams played.
Well, the first thing to note with last year is Alabama was sort of a shell of the team they were. They had third-string players playing in the defensive line, backups across the board at inside linebacker, and you can't really play effective football right. I mean, they're on. I think they were third-string nose guard and a third-string or backup defensive end. They couldn't stop the run, and that really defined the game last year for Alabama. Was Auburn was getting 6 yards of carry whenever they wanted to, and that changes the dynamic for Auburn. We talk about this all the time. That offense is built from the inside out. If Auburn can win the inside run and force the linebackers inside, that means they can get the edge on the perimeter, and then the reaction to that is for the safeties to start creeping up, and then Auburn hits you over the top. And it's a bang, bang, bang thing. Auburn really wasn't able to do that against most teams, but they played an Alabama run defense that just, it had collapsed at the end of the season, frankly. That's what it took, though. And when they played Minnesota, who was a really good run defense. They had 2 yards per carry, and they got embarrassed in their bowl game. Alabama is not an elite run defense. As we said, they're going to give up some yards, but it's not going to be 6 yards a carry. And I don't think it's going to be enough for it to quite equate. And whereas last season, I want to make the point, we were split on who was going to win the Iron Bowl. Daniel picked Auburn by 4. I picked Alabama by a touchdown. We really had minimal confidence, and we thought due to the defensive issues that Alabama was in serious trouble in that game. This year, I don't really have the same opinion, to tip my hat at it. And the answer is simple. One, Alabama is relatively healthy. In fact, partly probably due to COVID, they may be healthier in this game than they've been since the first 1 or 2 weeks of the season. Waddle aside, we'll talk about that in a minute, but particularly on the defensive side of the ball. And 2, they're coming in with their full offense in this game. And this is really the first time Auburn is going to face what has generally been Alabama's healthy offense dating back for a number of years. I'll give you one stat. So, we've had all the discussion, talked about where Alabama and Auburn are, but let's be clear about what Auburn are and Alabama are just going into the game, period, okay? There were 4 common opponents for these teams: Kentucky, Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Georgia. Auburn won those games on average by a score of 25 to 21.25, so about a 3.5 point victory on average for Auburn. Alabama played and won those games by an average score of 53.7 to 23, a 30-point margin of victory where Auburn had a 3-point margin. And the defenses are about the same there. 21 points given up by Auburn, 23 for Alabama. Now, that number is way worse looking if you throw out the Ole Miss game, which I don't know if you want to or don't want to, and I don't really even want to get into that conversation. Though I will say Steele's simple defense is far better than Alabama's more complicated defense. It's kind of a horrible mismatch for Ole Miss when they played Alabama, and Auburn was a perfect match for stopping Ole Miss. But the difference is it's a 30-point margin. And when you look at the 24, I think, point spread, I just looked it up because Daniel mentioned it, I think you kind of see it there, right? I mean, that 27-point differential is pretty close to what the point margin is. And it really comes down to the fact that Alabama's offense is twice as good as Auburn's offense. And even if the teams are quite similar defensively, statistically, Alabama is still going to score twice as many points, and it makes it an extremely difficult game for Auburn to be able to win.
Since you're talking numbers and common opponents, why don't you go ahead and get into the model, and we'll talk off of it.
Sure. So our model, if you haven't watched us, is a per-play model. We look at how you did against your teams in a relational sense. We look at how they did against everybody else, and then based off the quality of your opponent and your performance, we build an idea of what your production is going to be in the game. And then the next stage is the model is sort of self-taught, where it looks at your season this year and how your performance is translated into points, and it does machine learning to figure out what your point production is going to be in this particular game based off what your own triggers are. It's designed to be a neutral model to tell you if both teams play their B-plus game based off what you played throughout the season to this point, what does that game actually look like? And the answer is a decided Alabama victory. Simply put, as an intermediary statistic, we look at percentage of opponent averages allowed. That's, if your opponent averages 5 yards per carry and you allow 4, you allow 80% of their average. This year, that's only based off SEC stats, so it's a little more mediocre looking. But the teams are pretty similar, about 90% against the pass for both. Alabama's a little better against the run, actually, than Auburn, 91% and 97%. It really comes down to the fact that Auburn's opponents are, just have been about the same, and they've given up about a half yard per carry more. The differential is totally in the offensive production. Both teams have similar run stats, but Alabama averages 4 yards per attempt more, about 50% better passing than Auburn does, and that's enough for a 50% differential in projected yards per play. 5.2 yards per play from Auburn is enough to have a solid offensive outing. 7.8 yards per play from Alabama is, high scoring in the 40s, blowout city. And that's what you see in the score. The projection is 47 to 18. That's high. That's a 29-point margin of victory, so a little higher than the current odds, but not that far off. And it really is a reflection of Alabama's offensive output more than anything in this game.
So one thing about the model and models in general, the good thing and bad thing about them is that they don't have a recency bias, and ours does not. Ours takes you as a whole, and I think college football fans in general succumb way too much to recency bias. We've seen this. Oklahoma fans are killing us this week because we weren't excited about them scoring a bunch of points on Texas Tech and Kansas, the 114th and 125th ranked scoring defenses in the country. So a lot of times recency bias has a lot to do with who you played. But for me, I think in this case, the model is a little off in terms of not giving Auburn enough credit for recency bias and maybe giving Alabama too much credit for a Kentucky team that is not nearly as good as they were in week one. Same thing with Tennessee, though that concerns me a little bit because I think Auburn should have killed them. I think Auburn's a better team than they're getting credit for nationally. I think they're a better team than our model's giving them, but I don't think that they're on the same level as a team that would challenge Alabama. I don't think they're in that 4 to 7 ranked range. Obviously not 1 to 3 ranked range, but it is the Iron Bowl. I'm going to give my score here 42 to 24, Alabama, and I think it's going to be uncomfortable, kind of like weirdly like the Kentucky game where Auburn is not punting the ball in the first half. They're going to get first downs. They're going to get into the red zone. The question is it going to be like last year where they score touchdowns every time? Or is it going to be like this year where Alabama has played some bend but don't break, forced field goals? If you're forcing field goals as Alabama, you're gonna win every time because you're gonna get touchdowns. So 42 to 24 is what I got. Give me your score, and then we'll talk about this a little more.
So my score is 48 to 24, and that really wasn't planned. And I also, by the way, didn't know that it was a 24-point spread when I decided on that before the video. It really comes down to one thing to me. Last year, Auburn had a decided edge defensively. We talked about this year. Alabama and Auburn defensively are pretty similar. Alabama's maybe just a touch better statistically. Now you can talk about who they played and when they played them. And Alabama managed to pick up some bad offensive teams playing poorly late in the year, and that did kind of inflate their stats, I think. But last year, Auburn had a decided advantage. Alabama was a bad defense late in the year, a genuinely bad one. Auburn had a really good defense, and that differential was enough to basically let them slow down Alabama enough and get enough turnovers in particular to keep pace and be able to win the game with the offense. The other thing I'll note about this game is, scoring percentages for Auburn are not the same. In modern college football, and particularly in today's game, we've talked about this for years, and I think this year it seems like there's a public consensus catching up to us, and we've got enough record for me to say we've been on this for a while. The way you win games is by stopping people in the red zone. It is extremely hard to stop a good offense between the 20s. I think Auburn is actually becoming a pretty good offense in 2020. I don't know that they're elite. And the difference between pretty good and elite is your ability to score inside the 20s. Last year, Auburn's red zone touchdown percentage was 71%. They scored 90% of the time when they got in the red zone, and 71% of the time it was a touchdown. This year, those numbers have dropped. They still score 83% of the time, but they only score touchdowns 58% of the time. They're roughly about 50% more likely, or maybe a third more likely to kick a field goal than they were last season. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you look at it over the course of the season, the fact that last year you've got some bad opponents thrown in and some things like that, in the big games, it matters. And in the big games is when those touchdowns become field goals. That's where you fall behind and they chase. We saw that with Kentucky last week with Alabama. They moved the ball pretty well between the 20s early. They had to settle for field goals. When they missed their, I think it was like third field goal in the game, I basically just conceded and stopped paying full attention to it because I knew it was over. Alabama was at like 14-3, I think, became 21-3, and that was all she wrote because Alabama was scoring touchdowns and Kentucky wasn't matching. That's going to be Auburn's problem, I think, in this game. Is Alabama's going to be scoring touchdowns, Auburn's going to be moving it, but settling for field goals or ending up punting after a promising drive. That's going to snowball on Auburn, I think, and Auburn is not equipped to score in the 40s this year with this offense. They're just not equipped to throw first. They weren't last year, and the offense didn't score in the 40s against Alabama. They were able to stay on schedule, and I think that inability to stay on schedule, that inability to score touchdowns, and the margin that that's going to create is going to be the thing that causes this to be a blowout.
So let's talk about Alabama for a minute. I'm going to take the good one, and I'm going to give you the maybe bad one because you're the Grim Reaper, and since I'm on camera and people see me, I want them to like me. So I'm going to take the good one. One of the things that's really encouraged me about Alabama this year, everybody's been on the Fire Pete Golding train, but something that either Golding or Saban or a combination of the two has really impressed me is second half adjustments were non-existent last year. Second half adjustments defensively have been the best in the country. Even the Ole Miss game, they did enough to slow Ole Miss down in the second half to ultimately get a multiple score win in that game. Georgia, they blanked them. Kentucky was moving the ball early. They didn't even get that opportunity to get in the red zone in the second half against Alabama. Alabama was shutting it down, getting the 3-and-outs. They're not a 3-and-out team this year, and I don't think anybody is. And I think that's what Alabama fans are having a hard time adjusting to is they're used to seeing a lot of consecutive punts, and they're not seeing those anymore, but it's a new game. It's not 2008 anymore. You're not beating LSU, and even though it was not too long ago, 10-0, it's not that game anymore. Second half adjustments have really impressed me. The thing that I'm a little concerned with, and we were talking about this yesterday and a little bit before the show, and I want you to touch on it, even though there's a silver lining in this game with Najee Harris. The passing game, maybe it's Waddle, maybe it's people got tape on Mac Jones, something. The passing game feels off. And I want you to touch on that a little bit, even maybe in respect to this game
First,
or
I'm
in general,
and talk about what you just
and whether
about.
or not that concerns you.
And that's the third down conversion, because I think there's some interesting stats there. Early on in the year, a lot of people like to trumpet the fact that Alabama was something like 116th or 118th in the country or whatever, like dead last in opponent third down conversion percentages around week 4. If you follow us on Twitter, we're at CFB Nerds. We throw out a lot of like random stats and facts. And one thing we talked about was basically there were 7 good offenses and 7 bad offenses in the SEC. And whether or not you were good or bad in third down conversion was just really purely dependent on had you faced the good teams or the bad teams. Alabama had faced Ole Miss. They'd faced Missouri. They'd faced Texas A&M. They were all on the high end of third down conversion percentages. In some of the teams that were really good at that point in time, quote unquote, I think Arkansas was an example. They had faced teams that were really on the low end of it. And that's all those numbers represented, really, was who you played. Alabama is not bad at opponent third down conversion percentages anymore. They were over 50% in week 4. They have not allowed more than 25% in 3 weeks. At this point, they are second in the conference at 38% of opponent third down conversions. I'll note Auburn is 13th in the conference, allowing 53% of opponent third down conversions. And then nationally, Alabama is sitting at, not necessarily great, but like 48th. Auburn, on the other hand, is 118th. I don't think by the way, I'm going to do one aside even before I answer your question again. Stop looking at national statistics and thinking Alabama at 40th is bad, because it's Alabama related only to SEC teams. Daniel, I know you're going to want to do a rant. We'll do that. Let me finish my talk on receivers, and then maybe we transition into it. It's a complete red herring. Alabama statistics against the SEC teams don't have any relation to other conferences. But the numbers for Alabama have turned around completely, and they are actually one of the best, if maybe arguably the best third down conversion percentage team over the season at this point. So your receiver question. Alabama is suffering from missing Jaylen Waddle, and I think the biggest thing that he brought was a guy that won a lot of contested balls. I don't know how many highlight plays I saw where he jumps between two guys and was jumping up in the air like 6 feet in the air, taking the ball off a guy's head and coming down with it downfield. Mac Jones has thrown some risky throws this year and gotten away with it because he had, with Waddle, he had the best receiving core in the country, and they made him look good. Now I think they're kind of losing their rhythm a little bit. They're not quite sure what the roles are. Smith is still definitively the go-to guy, and he's easily one of the best, if not probably the best receiver playing this year in football. Not just a downfield threat and a smooth guy, but way more explosive than I think people give him credit for. And they've got another good compliment in Mechie, but it was a totally different dynamic with Waddle because they had stuff in the short game where they could hit Waddle. They had stuff in the long game with him with speed. And then they had two just all-around good receivers to complement him, and they had the whole playbook. I don't think they've quite figured out the playbook with the guys they have available. And I think I saw an injury report where Waddle's backup went out against Kentucky, and they kind of were out of sorts a little bit. I think they're still good. I don't think they're dominant in the way they were. They will beat you. They will put up points. But the way I'd put it is this. Alabama wasn't hitting third down early in the season. They, like the Ole Miss game, they had 7 third downs in that game. They just never got there. And later right now, they are. And wherein, if you got a stop or a negative play on Alabama, when you were Texas A&M, it would be like first or second down, you get a negative play, and boom, they'd hit 16 yards and get the third down conversion anyway. Now Alabama is a little more, getting to third down, and if you can get that negative play on third down, you can get them off the field. It's a lot easier to get them to punt because, what they were getting in 2 plays, they're now getting in 3. And the difference there is the difference between ever getting in third down and having the opportunity to get a third down stop, which teams were just not ever doing in the first half. Through now, that extra notch means they are getting to third down and you have the opportunity to get them off the field, even though it still is really hard.
Yeah, what's scary, to give a counter to that, though, is like 63 points versus a good, not great Kentucky defense without Waddle, without Waddle's backup, and also their top, really all their offense runs through Forrestal, tight end, was out. So they went from running a lot of like double tight sets and power run formations to running 4 wide with Billingsley. And it still worked. They made it work. But I think with Bolden in healthy, they're good. Obviously not where they were, but with Najee Harris in the game, it's balance. And that's the thing that Auburn hasn't seen a lot this year is balance. So to your point about statistic comparisons, we've talked all year quietly that like a team like Auburn would absolutely win the Big 12. Do you still agree real quick, yes or no? Big 12, maybe Pac-12, maybe second in the Big 10 would be in Auburn.
I wouldn't say necessarily absolutely, but I think we have a very good shot of winning the Big 12. They would definitely be in the title hunt. They would probably, on average, be about second or third in the Big 10, frankly. And they would be equal favorite to win the Pac-12. Legitimately equal favorite to win the Pac-12.
Yeah, so numbers are crazy this year. And I think we're going to find that out if there is a full bowl season, how we were wildly misperceived on how good teams were because it was only relative to the other teams in their conference. And so, with this weird thing, we're seeing Penn State can't get a win and they've quit. Michigan's kind of quit. So it's hard to know who's good and who's not. But I think Auburn is a better team nationally than they're getting credit for because they haven't left the SEC bubble. And because they had some bumps early in the year. All right, y'all, we went long on this one, but it's the Iron Bowl. We do it every year. We go long on this one. Give us your thoughts maybe on some of the other points that we brought up. Alabama's passing offense, whether or not you think Auburn's defense is on par with Alabama's. Let us know the score, and we'll get back at you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.